Thousands of German officers were captured by the Red Army in the final months of the war. In a few weeks, the majority were sent to transit centers, interrogations, and camps where their future was in the hands of the Soviet state. None knew if they would be tried, exploited as a labor force, or disappear without a trace. The system operated with strict logic. Each officer was classified, interrogated, and separated according to their rank, their unit, and the operations in which they had participated. Many were transferred to the Gulag, where forced labor and permanent surveillance determined their survival. Others faced Soviet military courts that quickly defined their fate. The end of the war did not mean freedom. For thousands, it was the beginning of years of confinement. What decided the fate of these officers? How did the Soviet system that detained them for so long actually work? The collapse of the Eastern Front and the massive capture, the beginning of the Soviet entrapment. The collapse of Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front did not occur suddenly, although the final months of the war gave the impression that the entire German military structure had given way at the same time. For the German officers, especially those stationed on the last lines of resistance in Poland, East Prussia, and the surroundings of the Oder River, the fall was a continuous process, a chain of events that transformed the Red Army into an unstoppable power. Since mid-1944, the Soviet offensive unleashed after the destruction of Army Group Center created an environment in which thousands of officers understood that the possibility of an orderly retreat was in the past. Although the Wehrmacht reports tried to maintain the appearance of control, the operational reality was completely different. Entire units were isolated. High commands lost contact with their subordinates, and the logistical infrastructure crumbled under the Soviet advance. As the German lines of communication were fragmented, the officers observed how the discipline and cohesion of the army eroded. Many remained loyal to the chain of command, but others began to think about their personal survival before the continuation of the war. In this critical phase, the experience of collapse acquired a dual character. On one side, the feeling that the military order that had sustained the Reich for years was disintegrating. On the other, the certainty that falling into Soviet hands would have potentially devastating consequences, especially for those linked to units that had participated in repressive actions or in executions of civilians in the occupied territories. Capture was not presented solely as the natural consequence of defeat, but as a personal threat. Nazi propaganda had fueled terrifying images of Soviet treatment of prisoners for years, emphasizing enemy brutality to bolster German morale. Although reality was not identical to the propagandistic view, the war in the East had been so violent and filled with reprisals that the fear existed with foundation. Officers knew that their rank would not necessarily protect them. On the contrary, they could be held accountable for atrocities committed by troops under their command, even when they had not directly participated. The notion of collective responsibility, so present in the Soviet post-war logic, amplified the fear among them. When the German lines completely collapsed in East Prussia, thousands of officers attempted to head towards the Baltic ports to flee by sea to the west. The roads were filled with mixed columns, exhausted soldiers, wounded transported in improvised trucks, desperate civilians, remnants of units that barely resembled a battalion. In the midst of this chaos, the Red Army advanced with relentless determination, penetrating deep and encircling entire regiments before they could reorganize. Officers captured during these chaotic movements often encountered a first reality that contrasted with their expectations. They were quickly disarmed, separated from the troops, and subjected to strict control aimed at identifying their rank, function, and possible involvement in criminal acts. Although the Soviets differentiated between ordinary prisoners and officers, the initial treatment was equally harsh. Recent battles generated high tensions, and at times, the Soviet units making captures had just discovered destroyed villages, mass graves, or direct evidence of German crimes, which influenced their attitude. The massive capture of officers in the surroundings of Königsberg during the last days of the offensive left thousands of them exposed to extremely precarious conditions, long marches to collection centers, lack of food, winter temperatures, and the uncertainty of not knowing where they would be taken. These marches constituted the first step towards a custody system that the Soviets had perfected since the 1930s, an apparatus of identification, segregation, and utilization of prisoners operating according to the political, military, and economic needs of the state. Once arrested, the officers were taken to improvised concentration points, where the priority of the Soviets was not the comfort of the prisoners, but the collection of basic information. The first inspection included the registration of personal documents, the confiscation of diaries, maps, insignia, and any material that could have military or political value. For many officers, losing their diaries or notebooks meant not only the loss of memories, but the disappearance of possible evidence of obedience to higher orders. For others, the loss of those documents prevented the Soviets from interpreting ambiguous annotations as incriminating evidence. At this initial point of captivity, the emotional situation of the officers varied according to their previous experience and their level of responsibility. Some maintained a defiant attitude, clinging to the military code that had governed their lives. Others adopted a stance of pragmatic resignation, aware that survival depended on not attracting the attention of the NKVD. There were also those who attempted to destroy documents, hide insignias, or adopt false identities to avoid being associated with units involved in war crimes. The Soviets, however, had accumulated numerous files that allowed them to verify the identity and function of many of the prisoners. The arrival of the captured officers at the transit centers marked the transition from the chaos of the battlefield to a more structured system. These centers, jointly managed by the Red Army and security agencies, were designed to process large numbers of prisoners quickly. The classification became more meticulous. The officers were interrogated about their unit, their position within the command structure, and the recent movements of their troops. Although many tried to minimize their role, the Soviets knew that the officers retained a clear view of the internal workings of the Wehrmacht. The conditions in the transit centers were harsh: overcrowding, food shortages, lack of shelter, and the constant psychological pressure of the interrogations. The winter of 1945, particularly severe in Poland and East Prussia, worsened the situation. Officers who had spent years in command positions now found themselves enduring nights in the open, sharing overcrowded barracks, or sleeping on frozen floors. The German military hierarchy, so rigorous in times of combat, began to dissolve in this new context. The transition from the transit centers to the railway routes leading into the interior of the Soviet Union represented the moment when the officers understood the magnitude of their situation. The freight trains became a space where survival depended on mutual support and physical endurance. During these journeys, which could last days or weeks, the prisoners began to hear rumors about the labor camps, about the frozen regions where many were sent, and about the more intense interrogations that awaited them. As they ventured further into Soviet territory, the sense of definitive separation from the known world increased. For many officers, the geographical distance became a metaphor for the moral and political distance that separated them from the future of Germany. It was no longer just about the military defeat, but the absolute ignorance about the fate of their families, the continuity of the Reich, or the possibility of ever returning to their country. At this point, captivity became an internal as much as an external process, a mixture of uncertainty, fear, and the slow acceptance that their lives had changed forever. From the transit camps to the repressive machinery, the Soviet system of prisoner classification. The process that the German officers faced after their capture did not end on the battlefield, nor in the improvised enclosures where they were initially gathered. The Soviet machinery responsible for processing the prisoners was designed to absorb, organize, and exploit tens of thousands of people, using criteria that combined military interests, internal security, and political justice. For the officers, this system represented an absolute change in their relationship with the power structure. They went from being part of a disciplined army with a clearly defined hierarchy to becoming pieces within a state machinery that examined them with a functional, distrustful, and oriented rigor to obtain the maximum possible benefit for the Soviet state. The first step of this process began in the transit camps, places established near the combat zones or at previously defined logistical points. These camps were temporary in nature, but their function was crucial. They acted as a kind of funnel where the Soviet army placed all the prisoners before sending them to more permanent structures managed by the NKVD. The atmosphere inside these centers was a mix of controlled chaos and bureaucratic purpose. The Soviets, familiar with the mass handling of detainees since the 1930s, had perfected a method to quickly examine large groups and classify them according to specific criteria. When the officers arrived at the transit camp, they were immediately separated from the low-ranking soldiers. The difference in treatment was not necessarily favorable. The Soviets considered the officers as individuals with valuable information, potential culprits of crimes, and influential figures within the German structure. Accordingly, they were subjected to a more intense level of scrutiny from the very beginning. The separation also served the purpose of dismantling any attempt to maintain the military hierarchy within captivity, something the Soviets deliberately sought. The disintegration of the German internal authority prevented the prisoners from acting collectively and facilitated their subsequent management. The identification process began with basic questions: name, rank, unit, place of capture. But behind that apparent simplicity was a system that cross-referenced data with information gathered throughout the entire war. The Soviets had accumulated an enormous amount of German documents captured in command posts and headquarters, abandoned during hasty retreats. These files allowed them to reconstruct organization charts, locate entire divisions, identify battalion or regiment commanders, and in some cases link specific units to massacres that occurred in Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Russian towns. The interrogators knew that the officers had a more structural role in these events, even if they had not participated directly, and thus the initial classification was crucial to determine who would be sent where. After this first identification, body inspections were carried out. The Soviets were looking for tattoos of paramilitary groups, marks that would reveal SS affiliation, scars indicating experience in certain units, or hidden decorations. Many officers tried to get rid of insignias or papers linking them to compromised formations, but Soviet units already considered the absence of documents as an indication of suspicion. The destruction of personal evidence was interpreted as an attempt to cover up responsibilities. In some cases, even the quality of the uniform, its wear, and the assigned weapons were examined to determine the officer's actual function before capture. Once this preliminary process was completed, the officers were taken to cabins, barracks, or improvised hangars, where they stayed for days or weeks waiting for the next phase. Life in these transit camps was extremely precarious. The Soviets supplied food in minimal rations, usually watery soups, black bread, and occasionally cereals. The priority was not the well-being of the prisoners, but their basic preservation until the classification was completed. The scarce food, combined with the low temperatures and unhygienic conditions, caused frequent illnesses. For the officers, accustomed to a certain level of discipline and structure, the experience represented a profound psychological shock. They lost the ability to plan, faced absolute uncertainty, and began to understand that their survival was in the hands of an administration completely foreign to their military codes. As the days passed, the officers noticed a clear pattern. Some prisoners were called for additional interrogations, others were moved quickly, and a few remained for long periods in the same place. This variation was not random. The Soviet system operated with well-defined categories that determined the fate of each officer. Among the main classifications were common Wehrmacht officers, members of units associated with reprisals against civilians, intelligence officers, Nazi Party members within the army, medical officers, and those linked to certain fronts where mass executions had been documented. Each category defined a distinct path within the repressive apparatus. The NKVD and SMERSH, the two structures responsible for handling prisoners of military and political importance, deployed specialized teams to conduct interrogations in transit camps. These agents had detailed knowledge of German units and were trained to identify inconsistencies in prisoners' testimonies. The objective was not only to determine individual responsibilities, but to reconstruct the chain of command and obtain information about German defensive strategies, internal organizations, names of high-ranking officials, and plans that could influence Soviet operations and the political reconstruction of Eastern Europe. Many officers, when subjected to these interrogations, sought to downplay their role or place the responsibility on others. Some tried to present themselves as professionals unrelated to Nazi politics. Others claimed to have been forced to follow orders without knowing their consequences. These arguments could be convincing for certain interrogators, but in the majority of cases, the Soviets maintained a skeptical stance. The ideology of the Soviet regime encouraged distrust towards enemy prisoners, especially the officers, seen as bearers of the military structure of Nazism. During this period, the final destination of the officers was decided by internal commissions. These commissions evaluated not only the information gathered during interrogations, but also factors such as the age of the prisoner, their physical state, their level of rank, and their possible usefulness to the Soviet state. Officers who possessed technical knowledge were especially valuable and were often assigned to labor camps where their skills could be utilized. Others, considered dangerous or politically relevant, were sent to special prisons or penal research centers where military trials were being prepared. The transition from the transit camp to the formal Soviet system was a turning point in the prisoners' experience. In the days leading up to the transfer, officers noticed an increase in camp activity, constant roll calls, separation of groups, convoy preparation. When they were finally called, they were ordered to form lines and were escorted to the trains that would take them into the interior of the Soviet Union. The loading into cattle cars marked the beginning of a new, even harsher stage of captivity. During transportation, the initial classification became more evident. Some wagons were destined for labor camps in the Urals, others were headed to prisons in Moscow, and still others to specialized centers in the Saratov or Volga region. On these routes, time seemed to stretch. The officers did not know if the journey would last hours, days, or weeks. The lack of information was part of the control the Soviets exercised over the prisoners. Each stage was designed to break the sense of continuity with the previous world and force the prisoners to adapt to the new system. Upon reaching their final destination within the Soviet system, the officers faced a new stage of the process, even deeper and more extensive. But everything began in these transit camps, where the Soviet repressive machinery took each prisoner and transformed them into a number, a file, an element within a system that sought not only to punish, but also to use, control, and in many cases, re-educate those who had supported the Nazi military apparatus. Interrogations, confessions, and collaboration. The struggle to extract information from the defeated enemy. When the German officers formally entered the Soviet detention system, the initial classification process gave way to a much more intense and prolonged phase, the interrogation stage. At this point, the immediate goal of the Soviet state was not only to determine individual responsibilities, but to accurately reconstruct the enemy's military structure, unravel the internal logic of the German units, and turn the captured knowledge into a political and military tool that reinforced the Soviet Union's position in the post-war period. The interrogation was not an isolated procedure, but a mechanism that was part of a complex network involving NKVD agents, SMERSH officers, military analysts, translators, and specialists in behavior psychology. The physical space where these interrogations were conducted varied depending on the type of facility. In the main centers, the Soviets had austere rooms with one table, 2 chairs, and a small electric light that was often left on for long hours. In more makeshift locations, the interrogations could take place in basements, temporary offices, or rooms in buildings secured after the occupation of German or Polish cities. For the captured officers, these environments were a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The lack of windows, the prolonged silences, the measured movements of the agents, and the periods of waiting before and after each session created an environment designed to erode the psychological resistance of the interrogated. The Soviet interrogation differed from the German methods not so much in its physical violence, but in its methodical insistence. The Soviet agents were trained not to rush. They established a routine, repeated questions, confronted the prisoner with previously obtained information, and forced them to explain again and again seemingly insignificant details. The technique was based on creating cumulative wear. For officers accustomed to clear hierarchical structures, this lack of time limits was disorienting. The duration of a session could vary from 1 hour to more than 12, depending on the resistance of the person being interrogated and the strategic interest they represented. Smersh, responsible for military counterintelligence, had a particularly important role in this process. Its objective was not only to obtain data about troop movements or defensive systems, but to identify infiltrated agents, members of German intelligence services, and officers who, according to Soviet evaluations, could become key figures during the political reconstruction of Germany. In this sense, the interrogations sought both the past and the future. They analyzed what had happened during the war, but also tried to foresee who could become an important actor during the Allied occupation. One of the most recurrent mechanisms of Soviet interrogation was the chronological reconstruction of the prisoner's military service. The agents demanded that the officer detail each transfer, each promotion, each change of unit, and each significant operation in which they had participated. This exercise served not only to obtain structured information, but also to detect contradictions. The interrogators took note of any change in tone, word choice, or the speed with which the prisoner responded. In many cases, the inconsistencies were not the result of deliberate attempts to conceal information, but of pressure, fear, or the simple confusion caused by fatigue. In parallel with the chronological reconstruction, the interrogators sought to identify specific responsibilities in actions considered criminal under Soviet law. This was one of the most delicate points for the German officers, because the line between direct and indirect responsibility was extremely blurred in the logic of the Soviet state. If an officer had commanded a unit present in an area where an execution of civilians had taken place, even if they had not personally participated, they could be considered responsible for a mission or for having allowed their subordinates to act without supervision. This expanded interpretation of military responsibility created a climate of deep tension. The interrogation process was not linear. At times, the officers might go weeks without being called, which increased anxiety and uncertainty. At other times, they were summoned frequently, sometimes several times in one day. The questions could range from technical aspects to political issues about their affiliation with the Nazi Party, their opinions on Hitler, or their knowledge of operations carried out by the SS. The Soviets considered that every detail had potential value, and therefore never dismissed any information, no matter how irrelevant it seemed. The confessions obtained during these interrogations were treated as documents of great legal and political value. In many cases, the officers found themselves signing statements that summarized their words, drafted by the interrogators in language that emphasized their responsibilities. Although some prisoners tried to modify the content of these statements, psychological pressure, isolation, and uncertainty about their fate made most agree to sign to avoid greater consequences. At times, the signing of a confession was not an end in itself, but a step towards further interrogations, where that statement would serve as a basis for new questions. Collaboration arose within this context. For the Soviets, a collaborating officer was someone willing to offer broad, detailed, and verifiable information. Someone useful both for the ongoing war and for the future administration of Germany. Collaboration could take different forms. Some officers offered technical knowledge, especially engineers or logistics specialists. Others provided political inputs. They described rivalries within the Wehrmacht, identified potentially dangerous figures, or commented on the internal morale of the German army. A smaller group agreed to collaborate on specific tasks, such as identifying other prisoners, translating documents, or reconstructing military organization charts. The incentive to collaborate was simple: improve living conditions, avoid being sent to the Gulag, or aspire to special treatment. Although the Soviets rarely made explicit promises, the system structure made it clear that a collaborator was more likely to survive. Some received slightly higher food rations, individual beds, or the possibility of accessing warmer clothing. For prisoners weakened by hunger or cold, these concessions were decisive. However, the collaboration also involved risks. Prisoners who agreed to cooperate could become targets of hostility from other officers. If they were identified as collaborators within a camp, they could suffer attacks, isolation, or covert reprisals. The informal authority of German officers continued to exist within captivity, albeit weakened. For many, collaborating was a betrayal of the military code and an irreparable moral breach. Others saw it as a necessary act for survival. As the process progressed, the Soviets were accumulating a considerable volume of information, much broader than what any other Allied country obtained about the internal structure of the Wehrmacht. The reports prepared from the interrogations served to reconstruct battles, understand German defensive strategies, and especially identify those responsible for the crimes committed in occupied territories. The information flowed to Moscow, where analysis teams reviewed each statement and integrated it into individual files that would accompany the officer throughout their entire confinement. The interrogation did not end with the signing of a confession. It was a continuous process that could be reactivated at any time, even years after the capture. An officer could be transferred from a labor camp to an interrogation center if new questions arose, or additional evidence was found regarding their involvement in repressive acts. This constant possibility of being called again kept the prisoners in a perpetual state of psychological alertness. At the end of this stage, the officers were fully integrated into the Soviet repressive apparatus. The confessions, the gathered information, and the evaluations of the SMERSH and the NKVD defined their final fate: prolonged imprisonment, forced labor in the Gulag, military trials, or, in some exceptional cases, a life of controlled collaboration within the Soviet framework. Gulag: forced labor, punishment, and survival in a closed world. When the German officers were finally moved from the interrogation and classification centers to the Gulag camps, they entered a universe that operated under rules unknown to any known military logic. The Gulag was not simply a penitentiary system. It was an economic, ideological, and punitive mechanism that articulated millions of lives under a regime of absolute control. For the captured officers, this transfer meant a point of no return. They had gone from being members of a modern military machine to becoming an exploitable resource within the Soviet apparatus, where their physical strength, technical knowledge, or even their psychological resilience acquired a utilitarian value. The journey to the deep fields, located in regions like the Urals, Siberia, or Kazakhstan, represented an initial experience of dehumanization. The freight cars in which they were transported were designed for goods, not people. Ventilation was minimal, lighting practically non-existent, and sanitary conditions deteriorated from the first day. The prisoners stood or squatted for countless hours. The smell of dampness, sweat, and human waste permeated the air. The cold, in winter, seeped through the cracks in the wood, while in summer the heat turned the cars into suffocating chambers. Men died before reaching their destination. Their bodies were hurriedly removed when the train stopped at secondary stations. Entry into the field itself was a sequence of procedures designed to break any notion of individuality. The officers were required to undress for quick medical inspections, often superficial and focused on detecting contagious diseases. Their personal belongings were confiscated, even items without material value, but with emotional significance, such as family photographs or small insignia. The loss of these objects represented the last tangible link to their past life. The Soviets assigned a numerical identification and provided worn-out clothing, inadequate for the climatic conditions of the place. Many officers described this moment as the symbolic transition from their military identity to an anonymous existence within a vast system. Daily life in the Gulag combined three inseparable dimensions: forced labor, strict discipline, and constant survival. Each camp had an assigned economic function: railway construction, logging, mining, industrial production, or infrastructure maintenance. German officers, regardless of their previous rank, were assigned the same type of tasks as any other inmate. The notion of hierarchy was abolished. A colonel could find himself working alongside a private or with Soviet prisoners convicted of common crimes. The only criterion that could modify their assignment was the possession of specific technical skills, such as engineering or medicine, which the Soviets used pragmatically when necessary. The work began at dawn. The prisoners were awakened by guards who went through the barracks banging on doors or issuing loud orders. Many officers, weakened by hunger, disease, or lack of rest, needed help from other prisoners to get up. After an initial count, they were organized into brigades and escorted to the work areas. In winter, these morning marches were especially harsh. The biting wind, accumulated snow, and temperature below 20 degrees below zero made the march a test of physical endurance. The workdays used to last between 10 and 12 hours, although they could be extended if the assigned work was not completed. For the Soviets, performance was a central factor in the structure of the camp. Each brigade had a daily quota that had to be met. If not reached, the food rations were immediately reduced. This mechanism created constant pressure among the prisoners, as survival depended directly on collective performance. The German officers, unaccustomed to extreme manual labor, suffered especially in the first few months. Their bodies, often weakened by previous captivity, had difficulties adapting to the pace of the Gulag. Many fell ill quickly with dysentery, scurvy, or respiratory infections. Food represented one of the most cruel elements of the system. The daily rations consisted, in their most basic form, of a piece of black bread and a watery soup made up largely of water and vegetable scraps. Prisoners who met or exceeded work quotas could receive slightly larger rations, while those who did not succeed ended up with even smaller portions. This structure of reward and punishment created an atmosphere of tense competition within the brigades and reinforced Soviet control. For the officers, who had enjoyed relatively regular diets during their military service, the transition to a regime of sustained hunger proved devastating. The physical deterioration became visible in a matter of weeks: rapid weight loss, muscular weakness, dental problems, and a mental exhaustion that weakened the capacity for resistance. The barracks were overcrowded spaces, built with simple wood and poorly insulated. During the winter, the prisoners slept next to their companions to maintain body heat. The bunks, generally made of wood without a mattress, were infested with lice, causing skin infections and making rest difficult. Personal hygiene was almost non-existent. The officers, accustomed to strict hygiene rules during their time in the Wehrmacht, saw how their ability to maintain a minimal dignity was eroded day by day. The lack of hot water, the shortage of soap, and the impossibility of washing clothes frequently turned dirt into a constant presence. The Gulag was also a space where different groups of prisoners coexisted: common criminals, Soviet political prisoners, prisoners of war of different nationalities, and repressed ethnic minorities. The relationships between these groups were complex and often dangerous. The common criminals enjoyed informal privileges in many camps and acted as intermediaries between the guards and the prisoners. They often exercised violence against the German officers, not only due to ethnic or political rivalry, but also to consolidate their internal position. The Soviet political prisoners, on the other hand, looked at the German officers with a mixture of rejection and emotional distance. In this environment, the officers were forced to develop adaptation strategies, forming small cooperation groups, establishing mutual support pacts, or seeking protection under the figure of influential prisoners. The relationship with the Soviet guards varied, depending on the camp and the assigned personnel. Some guards displayed a purely functional attitude. They followed orders without a particular interest in the lives of the prisoners. Others, marked by traumatic experiences during the war, showed open hostility towards the German officers. However, there were guards who, moved by fatigue or the indifference inherent in the system, granted small privileges to the prisoners. These gestures, although minimal, could mean the difference between life and death in such an extreme environment. The passage of time in the Gulag took on an ambiguous character. For some officers, each day became a battle for survival with immediate objectives: endure the cold, complete the work quota, avoid confrontations, and get a little more food. For others, time turned into a homogeneous mass where the days blurred into each other. The lack of information about the outside world amplified this feeling of isolation. Many officers were unaware for months or years of the outcome of the war, the fate of their families, or the political situation in Germany. Despite the harshness of the system, there were moments when the officers found small networks of emotional support. Some shared stories of their former lives, recalled episodes from the army, or recounted family anecdotes. These nighttime conversations, held in low voices to avoid interruptions, allowed the prisoners to maintain a minimum sense of identity. There were also exchanges of skills. An officer with medical knowledge could offer rudimentary care to others. An engineer could design improvised solutions to improve the ventilation of a barracks or repair defective tools. Death was a common presence in the Gulag. The bodies of deceased prisoners were removed early in the morning and transported to mass graves on the outskirts of the camp. The frequency of these deaths generated in the officers a mixture of resignation and lingering fear. Death, in this context, became part of the daily rhythm of the camp, one more certainty within a system designed not only to exploit the labor force, but also to reorganize the prisoner's identity, depriving them of everything that defined their previous life: trials, responsibilities, and sentences, the weight of crimes in Soviet territory. When the German officers moved from the interrogation stage to the Soviet judicial domain, they entered a process that, although presented as a military justice system, combined punitive, political, and symbolic objectives. For the Soviet Union, judging the captured officers was not only a legal act, it was an affirmation of their victory, a demonstration of their ability to administer justice in the face of the crimes committed on their territory, and a tool to shape the historical narrative that would be conveyed to their population and the world after the war. Each officer thus became a bearer of responsibilities broader than individual ones, since the Soviet state saw in them the personification of a war machine that had devastated cities, executed civilians, and sought the destruction of the country. The legal process began before the officer set foot in a courtroom. From the days when the interrogations intensified, the NKVD and SMERSH started to compile detailed files. These documents contained the prisoner's military history, prior statements, interrogation reports, testimonies from other prisoners, and in some cases, physical evidence recovered in the occupied territories. The structure of the file reflected a cumulative logic. Any data, no matter how small, could become relevant if new information arose that provided context for it. The officer was evaluated not only for his actions, but also for the place he had occupied within the German military hierarchy and for the responsibility the Soviets believed assignable to his rank. The Soviet authorities distinguished several levels of responsibility. At the lowest level were the officers who had served in regular units, without direct records of participation in crimes. At an intermediate level were those who had exercised command in areas where reprisals, forced evictions, or executions of civilians had been documented. Finally, at the highest level, were the officers linked to specific operations in Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, or Russia, areas where German violence reached its highest expression. For the latter, the trial was almost inevitable and the sentence predictable. Before the trial, the NKVD could keep the prisoner in isolation for days or weeks in order to reinforce psychological pressure and ensure that their statements were consistent with the conclusions desired by the authorities. In some cases, the officers were brought to confrontations with other prisoners who confirmed or denied specific aspects of their accounts. These confrontations were carefully orchestrated by the interrogators, who sought to reveal contradictions or reinforce the lines of argument in the file. When the trial was finally scheduled, the transfer to the court was carried out under strict security measures. The prisoners were escorted by armed guards with shackles on their wrists and taken to enclosed vehicles. For many officers, this journey represented one of the tensest moments of the entire process. Although they knew that the chances of acquittal were minimal, there was still uncertainty regarding the sentence: prolonged, forced labor, prison terms under harsh conditions, or immediate execution. Upon entering the courtroom, the officers were met with an environment designed to assert the authority of the state. The majority of these trials were held before Soviet military tribunals, composed of high-ranking officers. The atmosphere was tense, solemn, and deeply formal. The defendant was placed standing, isolated from the rest of those present, with guards on either side. The judges wore impeccable uniforms, and their expressions were impenetrable. The objective was to establish a clear power dynamic, the victorious state judging the defeated enemy. The Soviet prosecutors played a central role in the development of the trial. Their arguments followed a precise narrative structure. They demonstrated the damage caused to the Soviet people, contextualized the actions of the accused within the German aggression, and presented evidence aimed at connecting the officer with specific crimes. Even in cases where direct evidence was limited, the prosecutors used the logic of command responsibility to argue that the officer must have had knowledge of the actions of his subordinates, or that he had participated indirectly through the implementation of superior orders. This expanded interpretation of military responsibility allowed a large number of officers to be tried without the need to demonstrate their direct participation in a specific act. The accused officers, when given the opportunity to speak, adopted various strategies. Some tried to argue that they had acted as professional soldiers, following legitimate orders without knowledge of criminal actions. Others claimed that their unit had not been present in the areas mentioned in the file, or that they had held an administrative position without influence over punitive operations. A small minority, aware that their defense possibilities were limited, chose to partially admit the charges, hoping to obtain a reduction in the sentence. However, regardless of the approach, the defense options were scarce. The sentences varied according to the gravity attributed to the case. Many officers received sentences of between 10 and 25 years of forced labor, a punishment that, in the conditions of the Gulag, could amount to a slow death sentence. Others were sentenced to lesser but equally harsh penalties, such as 5 or 10 years of imprisonment in maximum security facilities. And a significant number, especially those linked with executions, destruction of villages, or active participation in repressive units, were sentenced to death. These executions were generally carried out by shooting, and were executed quickly after the sentence, sometimes in a matter of days. The public trials represented a particular phenomenon within the Soviet system. Although most of the processes against German officials were held behind closed doors, some were designed as public stagings, intended to demonstrate the moral legitimacy of the state. These trials were usually held in cities devastated by the occupation, or in regions where mass crimes had been committed. The population attended as witnesses. The presence of Soviet citizens, many of them direct or indirect victims of the war, reinforced the emotional dimension of the trial. These trials had a clear political effect, consolidating the narrative of Soviet resistance, strengthening the bond between the state and the population, and demonstrating that justice came down on those who had caused so much suffering. The Soviet system also used sentences as a tool for social reorganization in newly liberated territories. In some regions, trials of German officers served to establish a climate of control and warning towards potential local collaborators. The public condemnation of an officer not only punished an enemy, but also sent a clear message to those who might question Soviet power. Inside the Gulag, the arrival of a convicted officer altered the dynamics of the camp. These prisoners were seen by the guards as subjects of special surveillance, and on occasions were assigned to particularly hard work as part of their punishment. Some officers tried to integrate into the existing groups, while others kept a distance, aware that their backgrounds could generate resentment among the Soviet prisoners, many of whom had lost family members during the war. As time went on, some convicted officers had a second chance to review their cases. The Soviet authorities, especially after Stalin's death and the subsequent political changes, reviewed several files of prisoners of war. Some officers were relocated, others released before serving their full sentence. However, these cases were exceptional. For the majority, the sentence handed down by the Soviet courts marked their definitive fate. Together, the trials of German officers captured by the Soviets were part of a justice system that not only sought to penalize the crimes committed, but also to assert the moral and political hegemony of the Soviet state. For the prisoners, this process was the moment when the weight of the war, the orders received, and the actions taken materialized into a sentence that would accompany them for years, or until the end of their lives. Repatriations, disappearances, and silences. The long return after the war. When the war officially ended in May of 1945, for the German officers under Soviet custody, there was no immediate sense of closure or relief. The end of the conflict did not necessarily mean the end of captivity. For the Soviet Union, the prisoners, especially the officers, remained strategic resources, subject to trial, punishment, and economic exploitation. The idea of a quick and widespread repatriation was non-existent. The immediate reality was a prolongation of confinement, a slow and uncertain transition where the return to Germany appeared as a blurred horizon, conditioned by political, diplomatic, and economic factors that were completely beyond the control of the prisoners. The first few months after the German surrender were marked by confusion. Some of the officers held in transit camps thought that the end of the war would mean a drastic change in their situation. Some hoped to be transferred to zones under Western control. Others imagined that the surrender would pave the way for an international agreement that would guarantee their release. But none of that happened. The Soviet apparatus continued to function with complete autonomy. The Gulag camps kept receiving prisoners, the interrogations did not stop, and the sentences continued to be carried out. For many officers, the continuity of confinement after the war was psychologically devastating. They had survived battles, retreats, hunger, and cold, hoping that the end of the conflict would represent a doorway to freedom. Upon discovering that captivity persisted, they experienced a profound emotional breakdown. The lack of information worsened the situation. The Soviets rarely communicated to the prisoners the political decisions that affected their fate. In the camps, contradictory rumors circulated: massive releases, extension of sentences, transfers to the West, pending executions. The repatriation process was neither linear nor uniform. In the years immediately following the war, the Soviets established priority for certain groups of prisoners: weakened, low-ranking soldiers, seriously ill individuals, and some prisoners not linked to relevant military responsibilities. However, the officers were a different case. Their files were thoroughly reviewed, even years after having been compiled. In many cases, the Soviet state considered that a high rank was sufficient to justify a prolonged detention, with the argument that their role within the German army implied a latent responsibility. At the end of the 1940s, the growing tensions of the Cold War had a direct impact on Soviet policy towards German prisoners. The division of Germany into two states created a new framework for repatriation. The Soviets began to release selective groups of prisoners to the newly founded German Democratic Republic. This process fulfilled a dual purpose: to reinforce the legitimacy of the new socialist state and to feed the narrative that the Soviet Union acted as a liberator against past aggression. However, the majority of the officers were not released in that initial period. Many continued serving prolonged sentences that kept them imprisoned for a decade or more. Others did not have formal convictions, but remained detained under the category of non-repatriable prisoners, a designation that allowed indefinite retention until further notice. Living conditions in the camps did not significantly improve after the war. The basic structure of forced labor continued. Many German officers spent the entire post-war period performing strenuous work in mines, forests, or construction. Communication with Germany was extremely limited. In some cases, prisoners could send letters to their families, but censorship reduced them to brief and supervised messages. Many letters never reached their destination. Families, for their part, were unaware of the whereabouts of their loved ones. Germany was full of widows who did not know if their husbands were alive, dead, or lost in some Soviet prison. This uncertainty created a deep emotional void in German society. The lists of released prisoners, which were published periodically, were scrutinized anxiously by thousands of families, searching for a name among hundreds. Disappearances were a recurrent phenomenon. Not all were due to executions or deaths from illness. In many cases, the Soviet bureaucracy simply lost files, recorded names incorrectly, or assigned a prisoner to a camp without notifying the transfer. This caused some officers to disappear for months or even years within the system. In other cases, the disappearances were intentional. Prisoners considered particularly dangerous or valuable were held in secret facilities. These prisoners did not appear on official lists, and their whereabouts were known only to a small circle of authorities. Death in captivity remained a common fate. The accumulated exhaustion, poorly treated diseases, and harshness of the work caused thousands of deaths in the second half of the 1940s. These deaths were rarely communicated to the families, and when they were, the reports were usually vague. Deceased from illness, natural death, infectious complication. The common graves multiplied around the camps. Even when the Soviet Union decided to begin repatriating more prisoners in the early 1950s, many German officers had already perished. The most significant mass release process occurred after Stalin's death in 1953. The internal political change led to a review of cases and a partial move towards repatriation. Starting in 1954, the Soviet authorities began to release larger groups of German prisoners, including numerous officers. These releases did not occur immediately or uniformly. They were carried out in waves, carefully controlled, and with a marked political component. The released officers returned to a country radically different from the one they had known. Germany was divided, devastated, and rebuilding under two opposing models. Many returned to the Federal Republic of Germany, where they found families that had been relocated, homes destroyed, and a political climate beginning to leave the Nazi past behind. In the FRG, the former Gulag prisoners were received as victims, although German society also showed tensions regarding their role during the war. In the GDR, on the contrary, the released officers were received cautiously. The socialist state incorporated them selectively into social life, but also watched them closely. Some found employment in state industries. Others were marginalized because of their backgrounds. The official narrative of the GDR emphasized the crimes of Nazism, and many released officers were seen as part of that past. Their social integration depended on their willingness to conform to the socialist discourse and remain silent about the experiences lived in the Soviet camps. Silence, in fact, became a central element in the lives of many repatriated officers. The vast majority avoided speaking openly about the Gulag. They feared not being believed, feared reopening family wounds, or feared political consequences in the divided states. Some remained silent due to trauma, others due to shame, others due to the moral complexity of having survived a system that had destroyed so many comrades. The stories of the Gulag circulated in Germany for decades as fragmentary, incomplete accounts, crossed by pain and by the fear of remembering. However, not everyone returned. Thousands remained missing, buried in unmarked graves or lost in Soviet archives that would remain closed for much of the 20th century. The families of these men held out hope for years, even decades. The partial opening of Soviet archives after the fall of the USSR in 1991 revealed new data, but also confirmed the tragic scale of the missing. Some had died in the first years of captivity, others in the last. Many were not properly recorded. The return of the German officers captured by the Soviets was not a simple or heroic homecoming. It was a long process, full of uncertainties, marked by silence and absences. For those who managed to return, the homecoming meant starting a life from scratch in a divided and deeply transformed country. For those who never returned, the story remained suspended somewhere in the vast Soviet territory, shrouded in the bureaucratic fog of a system that administered lives and deaths with relentless efficiency and almost always without leaving a trace. Memory, politics, and oblivion, the historical consequences of their passage through the Soviet Union. The fate of the German officers captured by the Soviets did not end with their repatriation, nor with the closure of their criminal files. Their passage through the camps, interrogations, and trials left a lasting mark that would affect not only their lives, but also the collective memory of both sides of Europe. Soviet captivity was not solely an individual or military experience. It became a sensitive element in the construction of national narratives, a point of tension between memory and politics, and a territory where silence, in many cases, emerged as a form of emotional survival. The history of these officers was not fixed in monuments or celebrations. It remained suspended between fragmented testimonies, incomplete archives, and ideological tensions that defined post-war Europe. To understand the historical impact of his time in the Soviet Union, it is necessary to observe how national narratives were shaped in the Federal Republic of Germany, in the German Democratic Republic, and in the Soviet Union itself. In each of these spaces, the memory of the officers was conditioned by political objectives, social sensitivities, and processes of self-justification that sought to make sense of the recent past and draw the moral boundaries of the new international order. In the Federal Republic of Germany, founded under Western influence, the figure of the repatriated officer acquired a particular nuance. The first returns, especially those of the late 1940s and the 1950s, were received with a collective feeling of relief and empathy. Cities and towns organized local welcome events where families reunited after years of uncertainty. These events had a deeply human dimension, but also articulated a political message. West Germany presented itself as a refuge for those who had suffered in Soviet camps, regardless of their role during the war. In a country dealing with the shadow of Nazism, the repatriates were often integrated into a narrative in which the victim of communism occupied a more comfortable symbolic space than the figure of the perpetrator of the Nazi regime. This process did not hide the facts of the past, but it did reorganize them. For a large part of West German society, it was easier to sympathize with those who had suffered years of forced labor in the Gulag than to confront the collective responsibilities for the devastation caused in Eastern Europe. The testimonies of the repatriates helped to foster a dual view. On one side, German guilt for Nazi crimes, on the other, German suffering under Soviet repression. This duality became a central component of public memory, especially during the Cold War, when the FRG stood against the Soviet Union as a defender of Western democracy. However, this narrative integration had limits. Many officers remained silent about their role during the war. They knew that, although German society wanted to hear them speak of the Gulag, it did not want to hear uncomfortable details about operations on the Eastern Front or about units involved in reprisals. That silence was double: silence about what was experienced in the Soviet camps, because the experiences of violence, humiliation, and hunger were often too harsh to share, and silence about what was done during the war, either through direct responsibility or by omission. In the German Democratic Republic, under Soviet tutelage, the memory of captivity followed a completely different path. The repatriated officers were not perceived primarily as victims of the Soviet system, but as subjects who had to integrate into the new socialist project. The GDR state articulated a narrative that emphasized the crimes of Nazism and the legitimacy of the Soviet Union as a liberating power. Consequently, speaking about the abuses suffered in the Soviet camps was inconvenient. Unlike in the FRG, Where the repatriated were listened to and even celebrated, in the GDR their experience had to be subordinate to the official narrative. The silence imposed in the GDR was not only due to external political reasons, but also to the internal need to consolidate a coherent narrative of the past. Denouncing the conditions of the Soviet camps would have cast doubt on the moral authority of the state, whose legitimacy depended on the fraternal bond with the Soviet Union. Thus, the repatriates found themselves trapped between two contradictory memories: the personal memory of suffering and the public memory of the socialist state. Many chose to remain silent, whether out of fear, resignation, or because their experiences found no legitimate space within the official discourse. In the Soviet Union, the memory of captured German officers was absorbed by the broader narrative of the Great Patriotic War. For Soviet society, the war had been a traumatic experience that left millions of dead and devastated entire regions. In that context, the German officers were seen as direct representatives of a brutal and destructive enemy. The official policy reinforced this perception. The trials and sentences against German officers were presented as acts of justice, necessary to heal the nation's wounds. The fact that thousands of those officers died in the camps, or remained detained for years, did not generate public debate. For decades, Soviet society did not have access to detailed information about the fate of the German prisoners. The documents remained in closed archives, the figures were managed in a controlled manner, and the state had no interest in fostering a deep reflection on the treatment of the prisoners. The Soviet memory of the war focused on the victory, not on the subsequent repressive processes. Only with the opening of archives in the final years of the Soviet Union did clearer fragments of the German prisoners' experience emerge, but even then, the public narrative did not change substantially. The complexity of these divergent memories was reflected in later historiography. Researchers from West Germany focused on the human experience of captivity, reconstructing personal stories and paying attention to the conditions of the Gulag. Historians of the GDR, in contrast, prioritized the crimes of the German army and the legal aspects of Soviet justice, minimizing the dimension of subsequent suffering. In Russia, academic memory oscillated between the analysis of the repressive system and the defense of the Soviet role in the defeat of Nazism. However, beyond the official narratives, the deep memory was left in the hands of the repatriated prisoners themselves. Many returned physically and psychologically weakened. Their bodies reflected the harshness of forced labor, prominent bones, permanent after effects, chronic illnesses. Their minds carried the weight of trauma, nights of extreme cold, constant surveillance, daily deaths in the Gulag, the screams during interrogations, the absolute uncertainty about the future. Some managed to adapt to civilian life, form new families, and rebuild their professional paths. Others were trapped in a state of emotional isolation, unable to integrate their experiences into the post-war daily life. Silence persisted as one of the most widespread forms of managing the memory of captivity. The return to civilian life did not annul the previous experience. The overlap between military identity, the suffering of the Gulag, and the need for social integration generated tensions difficult to verbalize. Many officers discovered that there was no adequate language to describe what they had lived through. Their accounts were too raw or too complex to find a hearing in a society that, on both sides of Germany, tried to look ahead. Even so, the collective experience left deep marks on the post-war German identity. The existence of thousands of officers who had survived the Soviet camps introduced a human and moral component that complicated the simplified narratives about the war. The figure of the repatriated officer did not easily fit into the traditional schemes of victim or perpetrator. It was an uncomfortable symbol of historical ambiguity, someone who had participated in the military machinery of the Third Reich, but who had also suffered under a brutal repressive system. Currently, the study of the fate of these officers reveals not only the human dimension of captivity, but also the interaction between memory, politics, and silence in Europe. Their history is situated at the crossroads between two worlds that clashed with extreme violence, Nazism and Stalinism. In that intermediate space, the captured officers became witnesses to a relationship marked by hatred, distrust, and vengeance. Their later lives, fragmented by trauma and shaped by the political systems where they were received, reflect the complexity of 20th century Europe. The journey of these officers through the Soviet Union should not be seen solely as an episode in the military history of the Second World War, but as a process that highlighted deep tensions between justice and vengeance, between memory and manipulation, between personal survival and historical interpretation. The memory of their experience, marked by silences, contradictions, and pain, remains a reminder that war does not end with the signing of a surrender. It persists in the bodies, in the minds, and in the narratives that each society constructs to make sense of what has been lived.